The day Delia Barrett rode into Harlow Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1879, she had exactly $4.32 sewn into the hem of her skirt, a bedroll strapped behind a borrowed mule, and the kind of quiet in her eyes that only comes from having buried someone you loved with your own two hands. She was 31 years old, and she looked every year of it, not in a worn-out way, not in a broken way, but in the way that a piece of good leather looks after years of honest use. Strong, seasoned, weathered just enough to be interesting. Her hands, wrapped around the reins of that old mule, were rough with calluses that told their own story: years of hauling water, fixing fence line, skinning cattle in the cold morning air, and doing all of it alone after her husband Thomas Barrett had been taken by a fever in the winter of 1877, leaving her with 120 acres of dry Texas land that the bank had eventually decided it wanted more than she did. She had fought the bank. That was a fact that the people of Harlow Creek would eventually come to know about her, because it was a thing worth knowing. She had fought them with letters and with lawyers, and with a stubbornness that her mother used to call pig-headed and her husband used to call magnificent. But a widow woman with no male kin and a mortgage that had gone 3 payments behind was not a thing the First Territorial Bank of San Antonio had much patience for. And in the end, the papers had come with 2 men who wore suits and carried rifles, and Delia had loaded what she could onto the mule she had borrowed from her neighbor Hester Crane, and she had ridden out with her back straight and her jaw set, because the one thing she had never done in her life was let anyone see her break. She had ridden for 2 weeks. She had slept under open sky and eaten whatever she could find or barter for along the way. She had passed through 3 towns that had nothing to offer her and one that had offered her something she had no interest in, and she had arrived in Harlow Creek on a Tuesday morning with the dust of 100 miles on her coat and a clear and simple need. She needed work, not charity, not sympathy, work. The town of Harlow Creek sat in a shallow valley between 2 limestone ridges, and in 1879 it was the kind of place that was still deciding what it wanted to be. There was a saloon, a general store, a livery stable, a small church that doubled as a schoolroom, a doctor's office, a land office, and a scattering of homes and businesses along the main street that was still mostly dirt and ambition. The surrounding land was cattle country, good grass, decent water from Harlow Creek itself, which ran clear and cold even in summer. The ranches that spread out from the town were the heartbeat of the place, and the men who ran them were the ones who mattered. Delia did not go to the saloon, and she did not go to the church. She went to the general store, because a general store was the kind of place where a woman could ask a question without it becoming a piece of gossip before she had even finished asking it. She tied the mule to the post outside, smoothed her coat down with both hands in a gesture that was more habit than vanity, and walked inside. The store smelled like coffee and sawdust and dried tobacco, and it was dim after the brightness of the morning outside. A man behind the counter was stacking tins of peaches, with the concentration of someone who had decided this was a very important task. He was somewhere in his 50s, round-faced, with reading glasses perched on the end of his nose that he hadn't bothered to take off even though he clearly wasn't reading anything. "Morning," Delia said. "I'm looking for work. Any kind. Do you know who in this town might be hiring?" The man, whose name turned out to be Alton Greer, looked at her over his glasses with the expression of a man cataloging a new piece of information. He looked at her hands first, the way people in a working country always looked at hands before they looked at faces, because hands told you the truth. "You cook?" he asked. "I cook. I can also mend, clean, tend cattle, fix fence, break a horse if it needs it, and I'm a fair shot with a rifle if that ever becomes relevant," Delia said. "I'm not looking for anything that isn't honest work, and I'm not asking for anything except fair pay." Alton Greer set down his tin of peaches. "You've been through something," he said. It was not a question, and it was not unkind. "I have been through something," Delia agreed. "I am through it now and looking forward." The storekeeper was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Roscoe Underwood's been looking for a housekeeper. Good man, runs the W spread out about 4 miles east of town. Lost his cook and housekeeper back in February when she married and moved to Abilene. He's been making do and not making do very well, if I'm being honest. I could send word out to him if you like." "I'd be grateful," Delia said, "but if you don't mind, I'll ride out myself. I've never cared much for waiting." Alton Greer smiled at that, just a small one. 4 miles east on the main road, then take the fork with the 2 cedar posts. You'll see the house from the fork. She thanked him, bought a small twist of dried beef with 2 of her coins because she had not eaten since the previous night, and rode back out into the morning. The road east from Harlow Creek ran through land that was becoming green with the first real warmth of spring, and Delia ate the dried beef slowly and watched the country unfold around her as she rode. There was a quality to the Texas hill country that she had always loved, even in her worst moments. The way the light came down clean and direct, the way the cedar and live oak broke the flatness into something more interesting, the way the sky went on in every direction until you had to stop looking at it or it would make you feel very small. She had grown up not far from here, over in Caldwell County, and this landscape was in her bones the same way the smell of wood smoke and morning coffee was in her bones. It was not comfort, exactly, but it was familiarity, and in a life that had lost most of its familiar things, she was grateful for it. She found the fork with the 2 cedar posts exactly as Alton had described, and she could see the house from there. It was a good-sized ranch house, white painted, with a wide porch across the front and a red barn behind it that was larger than many houses she had known. There were corrals and outbuildings, and the whole thing had the look of a place that was well-made and well-maintained, though as she rode closer she could see that recent weeks had allowed certain small neglects to accumulate: laundry that hadn't been brought in, wood that needed splitting, a garden plot that had been started and then abandoned to the weeds. She rode into the yard and dismounted, and a dog of indeterminate breed came out from under the porch and regarded her with mild suspicion, but no real alarm. "Good morning," she told the dog, and it wagged its tail once in acknowledgement. She heard someone before she saw him, the sound of hammering from behind the barn, steady and purposeful. She tied the mule to the porch post and walked around the side of the barn, and there he was. Roscoe Underwood was 35 years old, and he was the kind of man who fit his landscape the same way a good fence fit good land. Naturally, without affectation, with an evident sense of purpose. He was tall and lean without being thin, with dark hair that was just beginning to need cutting, and a jaw that hadn't met a razor in several days. He was fixing a section of fence board on one of the back corrals, working with the focused attention of a man who was thinking about the task in front of him and nothing else. He was in a worn blue shirt and dust-colored trousers and boots that had seen better years, and he looked like what he was, a working man on a working ranch. He heard her footsteps and looked up. His eyes were dark brown, and they were direct, not rude, not hard, just honest, the eyes of a man who had learned to take in information quickly and act on it. They went to her hands before they went to her face, same as the storekeeper's had, and then they met hers and held. "Mr. Underwood," Delia said. "My name is Delia Barrett. Alton Greer in town told me you might be looking for a housekeeper. I'm looking for work." Roscoe Underwood set down his hammer. He looked at her for a moment, not in the assessing way of a man looking at a woman, but in the considering way of a man who was trying to figure out how something fit. He looked at her face, which was direct and steady. He looked at her hands again, which told him everything the face confirmed. He looked at the mule tied at his front post, which told him she had come a ways to get here. "You come from town just now?" he asked. His voice was low and unhurried, with the particular Texas cadence that Delia had grown up around and found in this moment unexpectedly settling. "I arrived in town about an hour ago," she said. "I came straight to you. You have references." "I have the hands of a woman who has kept a house and a ranch for 8 years," she said. I have the word of Hester Crane out of Lockhart if you want to write her, and I have 3 recommendations from the Reverend Samuel Pace of Caldwell County, which I have written down. She reached into her coat and produced a folded piece of paper, which she held out to him. He came forward and took it, unfolded it, and read it. She watched him read, and she waited without fidgeting because she had always believed that a person who could not wait quietly was a person you needed to watch more carefully. He folded the paper back up and held it out to her. Can you cook for ranch hands? I've got 4 men full-time and sometimes more during cattle season. Yes. The house needs a thorough cleaning. It's gotten away from me since February. I can see that, Delia said, without any judgment in it, just observation. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face. Pay is $12 a month, room and board. You'd have the small bedroom off the kitchen. My men sleep in the bunkhouse, so it's just me in the main house, which is proper and above board. You have my word on that. I understand, Delia said. When do you want me to start? He looked at the mule at the front post. He looked at the laundry on the porch and the weedy garden and the stack of wood that needed splitting. He looked back at her. How about right now? He said. She started right now. The kitchen in the W Ranch house was a good one. A proper iron range. A good pump at the sink. Shelves that had once been organized and were now merely holding things. Delia found flour and cornmeal and dried beans and salt pork, and a sad collection of root vegetables that were beginning to think about giving up. She found coffee, which was the most important discovery, and she set about making sense of what she had to work with. By the time Roscoe's 4 ranch hands came in at noon, their names were Pete Garza, who was Mexican and competent, Cal Hobbs, who was young and enthusiastic, Old Ben Whitmore, who was neither young nor enthusiastic but was steadier than a fence post in good ground, and Jimmy Doyle, who was red-haired and freckled and treated everything like it was a small adventure. There was a pot of bean soup with salt pork thick on the stove, a pan of cornbread baked golden, and coffee strong enough to hold a spoon upright. The men came in and stopped when they smelled it. They looked at each other and then looked at Delia, who was setting bowls on the long kitchen table with the efficiency of long practice. Lord Almighty, Pete Garza said, in a tone of genuine religious feeling. Sit down and eat, Delia told them. I'm Mrs. Barrett. I'll be keeping house and cooking from here on. They sat down and they ate with the focused attention of men who had been surviving on their own cooking for 2 months and had not realized how profoundly they had been suffering. Old Ben Whitmore looked up from his second bowl with an expression of such sincere gratitude that Delia had to look away before she embarrassed them both. Roscoe came in last, having finished what he was working on outside, and he washed his hands at the pump and sat at the head of the table. He looked at the meal and he looked at her and he said, "Thank you, Mrs. Barrett." Mrs. Barrett, she corrected quietly, more to herself than to him, because she was not yet accustomed to hearing her own name said by a new voice, and it always did something unexpected to her chest when it happened. After dinner, while the men went back to their work, Delia turned to the kitchen with the same focus she had given the meal. She boiled water and scrubbed the range and scoured the shelves and reorganized them with a logic that she could have explained to anyone who asked. She swept and she mopped, and she took the laundry down from the porch and folded it neatly and sorted it into the right places. She was not doing this to impress anyone. She was doing it because this was what she did. Order was a kind of comfort to her, had been since she was a child, because when you could make the things around you orderly, you could tolerate more easily the things that were not. Late in the afternoon, Roscoe came back to the house for something, a tool he had left inside, she thought, and stopped in the kitchen doorway. He stood there for a moment looking at what the kitchen had become in the space of half a day. It was not just clean, it was alive again, the way a house is alive when someone is genuinely in it. You work fast, he said. I work steady, she said, without looking up from the shelf she was finishing. Fast and steady looked the same from the outside. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I ask where you came from?" She set down her cloth and turned to face him. "Lockhart," she said. "I had a ranch there with my husband. He passed in the winter of '77. The bank took the land last fall." She said it plainly, the way you said plain things without performance. His expression shifted not to pity, which she would have had difficulty tolerating, but to something more like recognition. "I'm sorry," he said, and it was the kind of sorry that was not a formality but a statement of fact. "Thank you," she said. "It was a hard thing, but I'm not broken by it, and I want you to know that because some men think a widow woman is a broken thing." He looked at her steadily. "Some men are fools," he said. And then he picked up the tool he had come for and went back outside. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after he had gone and then went back to her shelf, and she was aware of something small and warm in the center of her chest that she had not felt in a very long time and was not quite sure what to do with. She decided to ignore it and get on with the shelf. The first week passed in the rhythm of work, which was a rhythm Delia understood and found comforting. She was up before dawn every morning, with the fire going in the range and coffee ready by the time the ranch hands came in for breakfast. She cooked 3 meals a day, kept the house in order, began to reclaim the kitchen garden from the weeds. She had found seeds in a tin on the back shelf, and had drawn up a plan for the garden that she shared with no one but the soil. And she mended what needed mending, and fixed what needed fixing with the particular competence of a woman who had learned that waiting for someone else to fix things was a luxury she had never been able to afford. She noticed things about Roscoe Underwood in that first week. She noticed that he was a fair man, fair with his workers, fair with the animals on the ranch, fair in his expectations of her. She noticed that he said what he meant and meant what he said, which was rarer than it should have been in her experience. She noticed that he read in the evenings, which surprised her. He would sit in the main room with a book and the lamp turned up, and he read the way he worked, with complete attention. She had seen the small bookshelf beside the fireplace on her first day and had not looked at it closely. But in passing, she observed that he had Dickens and some volumes on cattle management and a well-worn Bible, and interestingly, a collection of Shakespeare that looked like it had been read many times. She noticed that he left her to her work without hovering or second-guessing, which she appreciated more than she could have said. There was nothing more exhausting than working for a person who could not trust you to work. He noticed things about her, too. She would catch him watching sometimes, not in an inappropriate way, but in the way of a man who was thinking something through. He watched the way she handled the horses when she turned the mule out into the paddock. She was easy with animals, with a patience and a quiet authority that they responded to immediately. He watched the way she talked to his ranch hands at mealtimes, which was direct and warm and unostentatious, and the way they had begun to look forward to those meals in a way that was about more than just the food. On the 4th evening, he came into the kitchen when she was cleaning up after supper and he said, "Would you like some coffee? I usually have a cup before I turn in." It was the first time he had offered her anything, and she understood it for what it was, a small extension. A door opened a crack. "I would," she said. They sat at the kitchen table, not in the main room which would have felt more formal, but in the kitchen which was already her territory and therefore more neutral, and they drank their coffee and they talked. She asked about the ranch, and he answered in the straightforward way of a man who was comfortable talking about his work. The W had been his father's originally. His father had come out from Tennessee before the war and built it up from bare land. Roscoe had taken it over 12 years ago when his father's health had failed, and he had expanded it slowly and carefully. He ran about 400 head of cattle currently, and he was thinking about adding sheep, which was a controversial choice in cattle country, but he thought the land could support both if it was managed properly. She asked why he had never married, because she was a direct woman and she had learned that dancing around direct questions wasted everyone's time. He did not seem offended by the question. He thought about it honestly, the way he seemed to think about everything. "There was a woman," he said. "Years ago. She decided the ranch life was too hard and went back east to her family. He said it without bitterness, which she noted. After that, I suppose I just got busy and the years went by. Do you regret it? She asked. Not being married, he looked at his coffee cup. I regret not having someone to talk to at the end of the day, he said. I don't regret not having married the wrong person, she nodded slowly. That was an honest answer, and she appreciated honest answers. What about you? He asked. Your husband, what was he like? Thomas was a good man, she said, and there was nothing complicated about the way she said it. He was kind and he worked hard and he loved me well. We were married 7 years before he passed. No children, which was a sorrow to us both. She looked at the lamp on the table. I would not trade those 7 years for anything, but I have made my peace with the fact that they are over, and I am not a woman who lives in what was. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think you might be the most self-possessed person I've ever met. She looked at him with a glimmer of something that was almost amusement. I doubt that, she said. I think I have just run out of time for being any other way. He smiled at that, a real smile, the first full one she had seen from him, and it changed his face in a way she had not anticipated. It made him look younger and warmer, and something else she was not going to think about. She finished her coffee and said good night and went to her room, and she lay in the dark in the small bedroom off the kitchen and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into night, the horses in the paddock, the distant calling of an owl, the creek running somewhere not far away. And she felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was in a place that might be all right. The second week brought a problem, as the second weeks of things often did. 3 calves had gone missing from the south pasture, and there was sign of someone having been through the fence. Roscoe was out at dawn the next morning with Pete Garza and Cal Hobbs, tracking, and he did not come back until late afternoon with a face that was tight and tired. He told Delia that the calves had been taken by a small group of rustlers who had been working the neighboring ranches as well, and that the county sheriff had been notified and was making inquiries. It was Cal Hobbs who mentioned, over supper that evening, that the Harker Ranch to the north had lost 7 head 2 weeks prior, and the Delaney spread to the south had lost 4. It was an organized operation, and everyone was unsettled. Delia listened to all of this and then said, You mentioned the south fence has soft ground near the creek crossing. Roscoe looked at her. It does. Then that's where they crossed, she said. And they'll cross there again because rustlers are not generally creative men. They find what works and they use it until it stops working. If you put someone on that crossing for the next 3 nights, you'll either catch them or you'll convince them to move on to easier ground. Roscoe was quiet for a moment, and she saw him working through what she had said and finding it sound. He looked at Pete, who gave the smallest nod. She's right, Pete said, with a tone that suggested he was not surprised. Roscoe arranged the watch. The 3rd night, Pete and Cal caught 2 men attempting to cross the south fence with a rope on a yearling. The men were taken to town and turned over to Sheriff Dolan, and the rustling stopped. The neighboring ranchers sent word of thanks, and Roscoe said nothing about where the idea had come from. But at supper that night, he looked at Delia from across the table with an expression she was beginning to understand was his version of high regard, and that was enough for her. The spring moved toward summer. The garden Delia had planted began to produce lettuce and radishes first, then beans, then the tomatoes that were the pride of her efforts. The kitchen was a different place than it had been when she arrived, not just cleaner but warmer, with herbs hung from the rafters and a rhythm to its operation that the whole house seemed to order itself around. The ranch hands had become, in the way of working people who share meals and seasons, a kind of extended family. Pete Garza told her about his home in Chihuahua and the wife and 3 daughters he was sending money to and hoped to bring north in another year. Cal Hobbs was 19 and in love with the blacksmith's daughter in town, a situation he discussed at length without apparent embarrassment, and about which Delia offered careful, practical counsel. Old Ben Whitmore said very little about himself, which she respected, but she noticed that he liked apple pie above all other things, and she made it when she could, and he would look at the pie and then at her with an expression of complete peace. Jimmy Doyle was 22 and made her laugh more than she expected to be made to laugh, with a gift for comic storytelling that seemed out of place in such an open country, but fit him perfectly. She had not expected to feel belonging anywhere for a long time, possibly ever again. But belonging has a way of finding you when you have stopped looking for it, arriving not with announcement but with the quiet certainty of something that was always going to happen. Roscoe and she had their coffee in the kitchen most evenings now. It had become a habit without either of them deciding it, which was the way the best habits usually arrived. They talked about the ranch and about books. She had read some of the Shakespeare and some of the Dickens, and had opinions about both that were firm and well-reasoned, and about the town and the news that came through with the weekly supply wagon. She told him more about her life in Lockhart than she had told anyone, and he told her more about his father and about the years of building the ranch, and it was the kind of talking that is really a form of trust, the kind where you offer pieces of yourself and the other person handles them with care. One evening in early June, there was a thunderstorm that came in fast and hard from the west, the kind of Texas storm that means what it says. Lightning was splitting the sky over the ridge, and the thunder was rolling through the valley like something enormous was moving. And Delia had gone out to close the barn doors before she thought to think twice about it, and she was running back through the rain, warm summer rain, heavy and alive, when Roscoe came from the other direction having done the same thing she had, and they nearly collided in the yard and caught each other by the arms and stood there in the pouring rain for a moment, breathing hard from running. His hands on her arms and her hands on his, the lightning going somewhere behind the ridge. They were very close. She could see his face clearly in the intermittent light, the dark eyes, the strong line of his jaw, the water running in his hair. She could feel the warmth of his hands through her wet sleeves. "You should have waited inside," he said, and his voice was different from its usual steadiness, not quite steady. "So should you," she pointed out. He laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that happened before a person could stop it, the kind that meant something was real. And they ran together for the porch, and stood under its shelter listening to the rain come down in silver sheets across the yard, and they did not move away from each other for a long while, standing close in the way of people who have found something they are not quite ready to name. She thought about that moment for many days afterward. She thought about it practically, which was her way of thinking about things she did not know how to think about otherwise. She was his housekeeper. She was a widow who had arrived in this town with $4.32 and a borrowed mule and a need for work. She was not a woman who had illusions about what she was and what she was not. And Roscoe Underwood was a good man, a man of property and standing, and there were easier women he could set his thoughts on. But she thought about the way he looked at her across the kitchen table, and the way he reached for his coffee cup at the same moment she reached for hers, so their hands almost touched, and the way he had stood beside her in the rain without moving away. And she was 31 years old, and she had loved one man very well and knew what the beginning of something felt like. And she was afraid of it in the way that only people who have already lost something they loved are afraid of new things. She buried herself in work, which was not difficult because there was always work. The summer cattle round was approaching, which would mean a full crew on the property and 3 weeks of hard, intensive labor. She was already planning the quantities of food she would need, the supplies she would order from Alton Greer's store, the way she would manage the increased demand on the kitchen. It was Pete Garza who said something, which she had not expected. Pete was a quiet man of practical intelligence, and she had come to respect his judgment on most matters. He came into the kitchen one morning early before the others were up for an extra cup of coffee, and he stood at the counter and looked at her with the expression of a man who has been deciding whether to say something for a while. "You are good for this place, Mrs. Barrett," he said. "Thank you, Pete," she said. "And you are good for him," he said. "He has been alone a long time. Longer than just since February, I mean." She turned from the stove and looked at him. "That is not a thing you should be saying to me," she said, not unkindly. Pete shrugged with the economy of a man who knows he is right and does not need to argue about it. "I know," he said. "I said it anyway." He took his coffee and went out. She stood in the kitchen and breathed in and out for a minute and then went back to the biscuits. The summer round brought 12 additional men from the area ranches, men who rode with Roscoe's regular crew and camped out on the grazing range and brought cattle down for counting and branding. The kitchen was in full operation from 4 in the morning until 9 at night, and Delia did not slow down once. She was feeding 18 men 3 times a day, and she did it with an efficiency that several of the visiting hands remarked on, with an admiration that was both genuine and slightly stunned. On the 3rd day of the round, one of the visiting men, a rough-mannered fellow from the Harker Ranch called Slade, said something at breakfast that Delia did not hear fully, but that made old Ben Whitmore put down his fork and look at the man with an expression that could have frozen a river. She was at the stove, and she heard the change in the room's tone and turned. Slade was the kind of man who existed in the West in a particular type, not outright violent, just careless about who he hurt and indifferent to the feelings of people he considered below him. He had made some comment about widows looking for arrangements, with the kind of knowing tone that was meant to land in a particular way, and it had landed and the room was very quiet. Roscoe was not in the kitchen. He was outside with the crew leaders, going over the day's count. Delia set down the spoon she was holding with a deliberateness that was very quiet and walked to the table and looked at Slade with eyes that had, as one might recall, seen too much to be frightened by a small man making small remarks. "You are a guest at this table," she said, "and you will speak as a guest or you will eat somewhere else. I have fed difficult cattle in difficult weather and difficult banks, and I have not yet had a difficult man get the better of me, and I am not planning to start today. Now eat your breakfast or leave it." The kitchen was very, very quiet. Slade looked at her for a moment and then looked away, which was the sensible choice. The room exhaled. Cal Hobbs looked at his plate, but his ears were bright red in a way that meant he was trying not to smile. Pete Garza drank his coffee with perfect serenity. Later that afternoon, Roscoe came back to the house for water and found Delia on the porch shelling beans, and he stopped. "Cal told me what happened at breakfast," he said. "It was a small thing," she said, without looking up from the beans. "It wasn't," he said, "and I'm sorry I wasn't there." She looked up at him then. He was standing on the porch steps below her, which put them nearly at the same height, and the afternoon sun was behind him, and she could see his face clearly. He looked bothered in a way that was not about the inconvenience of a disruption, but about something more personal than that. "Roscoe," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name and they both noticed it. "I handled it." "I know you did," he said. "That's not the point." She set down the beans. "Then what is the point?" He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working through something, which was his way. He did not speak before he had thought, and she had come to appreciate that even when it made moments like this one feel very long. "The point," he said at last, "is that you should not be here in a position where any man can speak to you like that. You should be—" He stopped. "I should be what?" she asked, and her voice was gentler than she intended. He looked at her with those direct dark eyes. "You should be somewhere that is yours," he said. "Not borrowed, not for wages." The words settled between them in the warm afternoon air and neither of them moved. She picked up the beans again. "I will think about what you mean by that," she said. He went back to the round and she shelled the beans, and she thought about it for the rest of the afternoon with the particular focused attention that she gave to things that mattered. That night, after the additional hands had bedded down in the field camp and the regular men were in the bunkhouse, and the house was quiet, Roscoe came to the kitchen for his coffee and she had it ready, and they sat at the table, and for a while they did not talk. The lamp made warm light on the table between them, and outside the summer night was making its sounds. "What did you mean?" she asked. Not because she didn't know, but because she thought it was important that he say it clearly. He looked at his hands around his coffee cup. He was not a man who said things easily, she had come to understand. He thought them deeply, but the passage from the interior to the exterior was effortful for him, and she respected that even as she needed him to make the passage. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what Pete Garza said to me a few weeks ago." She looked at him. "Pete said something to you." "He said I had been alone a long time," Roscoe said, "and that you had been good for this place. And I told him he was a presumptuous man who should mind his work, and he said yes, sir, and went back to his work, and I have thought about it every day since." He looked at her. He was right on both counts. Delia was quiet. Her heart was doing something complicated. "I don't know how to begin to say this properly," he said. "I am not a man who practices this kind of talking, but what I mean to say is," he stopped again and then came back. "I was not looking for a housekeeper when I put the word out to Alton Greer. Or I was, but that is not what I was really looking for, and when you rode into this yard on that borrowed mule and told me what you could do and looked at me like you were daring me to underestimate you, something in me said—" He stopped. "What?" she said very quietly. "Something in me said," he continued, "that I had been waiting for someone like you, without knowing it, for a long time." The lamp flickered. Outside, a horse moved in the paddock. Delia looked at him for a long moment, and she was a woman who had learned to look at things honestly, who had looked honestly at grief and loss and loneliness and the relentless practical demands of survival, and she looked at him now with the same honesty, and she saw what was there, and what was there was real. "Roscoe," she said, "I came here with $4 sewn into my hem and calluses on my hands and 2 years of hard loss behind me, and I asked you for work. That is all I meant to ask for." "I know," he said, "but I am not going to pretend," she said, "that I have not sat at this table every evening and wanted to stay at it. I am not going to pretend that I have not thought about what you said on the porch today more than was strictly necessary. I am not a young woman, and I am not a naive woman, and I have loved before and lost it, and I know what I am talking about when I say—" She paused. "When I say that I think I am falling in love with you, and that terrifies me considerably." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. His hand was large and calloused, rougher even than hers and very warm, and she looked at their hands on the table and felt something open in her chest that had been closed for 2 years. "I am terrified too," he said. "But I think we might be the kind of people who do things even when they are afraid." "I believe we might be," she said. He squeezed her hand, and she turned her hand and held his, and they sat in the warm lamplight with their hands together and talked for a long time about honest things, about what they both wanted and what they both feared and what they both believed they could offer. And it was the best kind of conversation, the kind where two people are not performing but simply being, which is the only real foundation for anything that lasts. In the days that followed, things changed and did not change simultaneously, which is the way of things when a feeling that has been present for a while is finally acknowledged. The work continued, the round finished, the additional hands left, the regular rhythm of the ranch reasserted itself. But there was something different in the quality of the evenings at the kitchen table, a warmth that was explicit rather than implied, a willingness to be a little closer, to let silences be companionable rather than careful. He asked her to take a ride with him on a Sunday afternoon, the first Sunday that they both had a complete afternoon with no pressing demand, and she said yes. They rode east of the ranch, up onto the limestone ridge, where the country opened out into a view that went for what felt like forever, the valley below, the creek winding through it, the town of Harlow Creek just visible in the distance, and all around the wide green-gold Texas afternoon. She sat her horse beside his horse at the top of the ridge and looked at it all, and she thought that this was the kind of thing that a person stored away in the particular interior archive of beautiful things that they intended to remember. "My father used to bring me here," Roscoe said, "when I was young. He would stand right about here and say that there is everything a man needs right in front of him and he should never forget it. He sounds like a wise man," Delia said. "He was. He died 6 years ago. He would have liked you, I think." He looked at her. He was a man who admired people who did not waste time on foolishness. She smiled at that. I will take that as a compliment. It was meant as one. He reached over from his saddle and tucked a strand of hair that had come loose in the ride back behind her ear, with a gesture so gentle that she felt it far more profoundly than its physical proportion warranted. She looked at him, and he was looking at her with an expression that was no longer careful or considering, but simply warm and clear, and she leaned across the small space between their horses and she kissed him, because she had established years ago that she was a woman who did what needed doing. He was very still for a moment, and then he kissed her back, and it was the kind of kiss that is not a beginning but a confirmation of something that has already been true for a while. They rode back down the ridge in the golden late afternoon, and there was no awkwardness in it, only the easy companionship of two people who have arrived somewhere together and are comfortable being there. That evening, Roscoe did something that she had not expected. After supper, when the men had gone to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was clean, he came and stood in the kitchen doorway. He was always in doorways, which she had noticed, always at the threshold, and he said, I want to ask you something properly, and I want to make sure I do it right. She dried her hands on her apron and turned to face him. He came into the kitchen, and he was carrying something she had not seen before, a small box of pale wood that was worn at the corners from being old. He set it on the table and opened it, and inside was a ring, a plain gold band set with a small garnet, nothing extravagant, nothing that pretended to be more than what it was, but real and honest like everything about him. This was my mother's, he said. She came out here with my father from Tennessee with almost nothing, and he saved for a year to buy her this ring on their first anniversary because he had not been able to afford a ring for the wedding. She wore it until she died, and she told me to give it only to someone I was certain of. He looked at her steadily. I am certain of you, Delia. I have not been certain of very much in the sentimental direction, but I am certain of you. She looked at the ring in its wooden box, and then she looked at him, and she was not going to cry. She was absolutely not going to cry because she had not cried in front of anyone in 2 years, and she was not going to start now. She cried, not loudly and not for long, and when she was done she straightened her back and wiped her eyes with her apron and said, Yes, I would be honored, Roscoe. Yes. He put the ring on her finger. It fit nearly perfectly, which she took as a sign from the universe that occasionally had enough sense to arrange things properly. And then he held her hand and looked at her in the lamplit kitchen, and she had never in her adult life felt so fully seen. They were married in the Harlow Creek church on the first Saturday of August 1879, a warm and beautiful day with the hills green from summer rain, and the sky a blue that would have been excessive in a painting, but was simply accurate in life. The Reverend Marcus Bowden, who was a spare and earnest man who had done his best by the spiritual needs of the valley for 12 years, performed the ceremony with a plainness and a sincerity that suited both of them well. The whole town seemed to find a reason to attend, which was the way of small places. Alton Greer was there from the general store, beaming as though he had arranged the entire thing himself, which, Delia supposed, he had contributed to in his small way. Pete Garza was there in a clean shirt that he had clearly pressed himself with great care, and he brought a small bouquet of wildflowers from the creek bank and handed it to Delia with a formality that made her eyes sting. Cal Hobbs was there with the blacksmith's daughter on his arm, who was named Rosalie, and who was pretty and sensible in equal measure. Old Ben Whitmore wore his good hat, which she had not known he possessed, and Jimmy Doyle recited a piece of poetry before the ceremony that he claimed to have written himself, which no one entirely believed but which was touching nonetheless. Sheriff Dolan was there, and the doctor, and the families of half the ranches in the valley, and it was the kind of wedding that becomes a community event not because it has been made grand, but because the people in it are people the community recognizes as its own. Delia wore a dress that she had sewn herself from fabric she had purchased at Alton Greer's store, a deep blue that was not fussy, but was definitively not her work clothes. And she carried Pete's wildflowers, and she stood beside Roscoe Underwood and said her vows in a clear, steady voice, looking directly at him. And she meant every word of them the way you mean words that you have chosen after enough life that you know what you are saying. Roscoe said his vows in the same voice he always used, the low, unhurried voice that she had come to find more comforting than any other sound, and he held her hands and looked at her as though there was nothing else in the room, which she supposed, at that moment, there was not. The celebration afterward was held in the yard of the ranch, which she and the ranch hands had decorated with paper lanterns and long tables draped with cloth, and she had cooked for 2 days in advance so that there was food enough for everyone. There was a fiddle player named Dutch Hendricks who could make a fiddle do almost anything, and dancing in the yard in the warm August evening under the lanterns that caught the light and threw it back up into the blue dusk. She danced with Roscoe, who was a better dancer than she had expected, with the kind of easy grace that came from knowing how to move in his body. She danced with Pete, who was formal and skilled and very serious about it. She danced with Jimmy Doyle, who was not skilled but enormously enthusiastic and made her laugh until her sides hurt. She danced with old Ben Whitmore for one slow song, and he said nothing the whole dance but held her hand with the careful precision of a man who was doing something important. And when the song ended he said, "He's a good man, Mrs. Underwood," and the new name settled on her like something she had been waiting to put on, and she said, "I know that, Ben. Thank you." The stars came out over Harlow Creek, and the lanterns burned warm and the fiddle played on, and Roscoe found her standing at the edge of the yard looking up at the sky, and he came and stood beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side and felt the solid reality of him, the warmth of him, the steadiness. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "I believe," he said, "that this is the best day I have had in a very long time." She turned her face up to look at him. "I believe," she said, "that this is the beginning of the best days we have both had." He kissed the top of her head, and she tucked herself more firmly against his side, and the fiddle played something slow and sweet, and the Texas night came down around them like a blessing. The months that followed were the substance of the life they were building together, which was different from courtship in the way that a finished house is different from the framing. The framing is exciting, but the finished house is where you actually live. Delia found that living with Roscoe was easier than any living she had done before, not because it was without friction. Two strong-willed and self-sufficient people in a house together necessarily have friction, and she would not have wanted it any other way, but because the friction was honest. When they disagreed plainly and without drama, talked it through to resolution, and moved forward. When they were tired or short-tempered, which happened because they were human people, they said so directly rather than performing patience they did not feel. She was not his housekeeper anymore, which had taken some getting used to, not the change in role but the change in her relationship to the work. She still cooked and kept the house, because she was good at those things and because she wanted to, but now she also had a full and equal say in everything else, from what the ranch planted in the kitchen garden to how many head they should run next season to whether they should invest in the new hay-cutting equipment that the implement dealer in town was promoting with enthusiasm. She was good at the business of the ranch. Better than she had known, and better than Roscoe had expected, though to his credit he never made her feel that the expectation had been low. She had a head for numbers and a patience for planning and a willingness to look honestly at what was not working and change it, and together they made decisions that the W felt for years afterward in the quality of its land and its stock and its books. Pete Garza brought his family north in the spring of 1880, his wife Carmen and 3 daughters, aged 8, 6, and 4, and Delia helped them settle into the small house Roscoe had built for them on the east edge of the property. Carmen Garza was a small, formidable woman who spoke limited English, but communicated perfectly in the international language of women who know what they are about. And she and Delia became genuine friends within a week, which was a satisfaction to everyone on the ranch. Cal Hobbs married Rosalie, the blacksmith's daughter, in the spring of 1880 as well, a development that surprised no one, and they set up housekeeping in town, and Cal continued to work for the W, which was a good arrangement all around. Old Ben Whitmore, who had been on the ranch since Roscoe's father's time, passed quietly in his sleep in the summer of 1880, which grieved everyone who knew him. Delia organized his burial with the same care she gave to everything, and she baked an apple pie and left it on the grave, which was a private thing that she told no one about. But Pete Garza saw her do it and told Roscoe quietly, and Roscoe thought about it for a long time. In the early autumn of 1880, Delia came to Roscoe in the evening with the lamp between them on the kitchen table, and she looked at him with an expression he had not seen before, not uncertain exactly, but very deliberate, as though she had been planning the exact words. "Roscoe," she said, "I believe we are going to have a child." He looked at her for a moment, and then he got up from his chair so abruptly it scraped back across the floor, and he came around the table and he knelt beside her chair and took both her hands in his, and he said, "Delia, I am 32 years old," she said, "and I had thought this was not going to happen for me, and I want you to know that I am—" She stopped, and her voice did the thing it very rarely did, which was waver. "I am very happy," she finished. He held her hands, and he was not a man who talked when he was moved, but he pressed his forehead against hers, and she felt how moved he was in the way he held on. The winter of 1880 was hard and cold, which was not unusual, and Delia's pregnancy progressed with a straightforwardness that she found characteristically practical of herself. She did not stop working. She adjusted what she did and how she did it, with the same logical approach she brought to every other challenge. But she kept the house, and she kept the kitchen, and she walked her garden in the cold mornings wrapped in Roscoe's old wool coat that was enormous on her, and that she refused to give back on the grounds that it was warmer than anything she owned. Roscoe watched over her with a care that was so unobtrusive it would have escaped notice if she had not been paying attention, which she always was. He rearranged without comment the things she used most often so they were easier to reach. He carried the heavier loads without making a thing of it. He came in from work earlier than he usually did, and he sat with her in the evenings and they read and they talked. And there was a quality of warmth in those winter evenings that she would carry with her for the rest of her life, as something she could return to in the interior archive of beautiful things. The baby came at the end of April 1881, attended by Dr. Emmett Hale, who was a steady and reliable practitioner, and by Carmen Garza, whose experience with 3 children of her own made her more useful than any medical text. It was a long labor, which Delia bore with a gritted determination that Doc Hale later described to the storekeeper as the most contained bravery he had witnessed in 15 years of practice, and at the end of it there was a boy. A healthy, loud, emphatically alive boy, who arrived in the world with an energy that suggested he had plans and intended to get on with them. Roscoe was in the room when he was born, which in 1881 was not entirely standard, but which Delia had simply stated she intended, and Roscoe had not argued because he had learned that there were things Delia stated and things she asked, and when she stated something it was because it had already been decided. He held the boy while Doc Hale finished his work and Carmen cleaned up, and the world reorganized itself around the new fact of this person who was in it. And he looked at the small face with an expression that Delia saw from the pillow, and that she would also carry in the interior archive, probably in the most prominent position. They named him Thomas Roscoe Underwood. Thomas for the man who had loved Delia first, because that was the right thing to do, and because Roscoe had suggested it without her asking, which was one of the many moments in which she understood with complete clarity that she had chosen the right person. Roscoe because he was his father's son. Thomas, as he was called, was a substantial and good-natured presence from his earliest days. He looked like Roscoe, the dark hair, the direct eyes, and he had Delia's habit of watching things carefully before he acted on them, which manifested first in the way he regarded the dog from his blanket on the kitchen floor with an expression of systematic assessment, and then in everything else he turned his attention to as he grew. The ranch grew, too, in the way of living things that are well tended. Roscoe's instinct about the sheep had proven right. He had introduced a small flock in 1880 to the skepticism of his cattle country neighbors, and the combination of cattle and sheep on the properly managed land had strengthened both operations. The W had a reputation by 1882 for good stock and good management, and Roscoe had a reputation for being a man of his word, which was the most durable kind of reputation. Delia had a reputation of her own, which was different in its details but equal in its weight. She was known in Harlow Creek as a woman of uncommon practical intelligence and uncommon fairness, a woman who helped when help was needed and spoke honestly when honesty was needed, and who had a particular gift for finding the center of a problem and addressing it directly. When Alton Greer's wife Mary fell ill in the spring of 1882, it was Delia who organized the meals and the care, and when the Garza children needed schooling and the church school had no teacher willing to take them because of the particular narrowness of some people's thinking, it was Delia who went to the school board and made a case with such clarity and such unwavering calm that the board found itself agreeing before it had quite decided to. She was not always popular. A woman with strong views and a straight spine was not universally beloved in 1882 any more than in any other year. There were people in Harlow Creek who thought she had too much to say, and people who thought that a housekeeper who had married up should know her place, and people who held various other positions that she found either wrong-headed or unkind. She listened to them when it was necessary, and dismissed them when it was possible, and moved forward when it was time. Roscoe supported her in this without qualification, which was not nothing in 1882 Texas, and she loved him for it the way she loved him for many things solidly, specifically, with full knowledge of what she was looking at. In the spring of 1883, they were expecting their second child. Thomas was too and fully invested in the position of center of the universe, which he occupied with such wholehearted conviction that it was difficult to disagree. He had Roscoe's walk already, somehow, at 2, that particular unhurried but purposeful stride, and he said mama and papa and dog and pie with equal fervor, and made the ranch hands absurd with affection, which they disguised as indifference and fooled no one. The second baby arrived in October of 1883, and she was a girl, which Roscoe announced to the assembled waiting ranch hands in the yard with a broad smile that was so unlike his usual contained expression that Pete Garza said afterward that he had not known that face was possible on that person. They named her Ellen Mee Underwood, for both their mothers. Ellen arrived in the world with her mother's directness and her father's calm, and the combination was formidable from the beginning. She regarded her older brother with the serene authority of someone who had decided she was in charge, and Thomas, after a brief period of fraternal uncertainty, accepted this with a philosophical equanimity that was very much like his father. They were, in short, exactly what they needed to be for each other. The years turned, as years do, with their seasons and their necessities and their small and large events. There were dry summers and wet ones, good cattle seasons and harder ones. There were neighborly disputes and moments of genuine kindness between neighbors that restored your faith in people. There was the arrival of the railroad in Harlow Creek in 1884, which changed the town and changed the commerce of the valley in ways that were sometimes good and sometimes complicated, and which Roscoe and Delia navigated together with the same practical intelligence they brought to everything else. Jimmy Doyle left the ranch in 1884 to try his luck in New Mexico, which he did with great enthusiasm and moderate success, sending letters occasionally that were entertaining and affectionate and full of the same quality of comic adventure that had characterized his life at the W. Pete Garza became Roscoe's foreman in 1882 and held the position with such competence that it eventually became difficult to imagine the ranch functioning without him. Cal Hobbs and Rosalie had 3 children of their own by 1885, and Rosalie and Delia were friends in the particular way of women who live near each other and have children the same ages and share the work of the community. Not the bosom friendship of girlhood, but something more durable and more useful, built on mutual respect and the understanding that the other person would show up when showing up was needed. On a fall evening in 1885, when Thomas was 4 and Ellen was 2 and the harvest was in, and the ranch was settled for the season, Roscoe and Delia sat on the porch of the house in the cool evening air. Thomas was asleep inside, and Ellen had only recently been persuaded to sleep by a song that Delia had sung twice and Roscoe had sung once, though he would not acknowledge this to anyone but Delia because his singing voice was, by his own assessment, a thing better suited to private family occasions than public display. The stars were out over Harlow Creek, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. The creek ran somewhere below the ridge. An owl was asking its question in the dark, the way owls always were. The dog slept on the porch boards at their feet. Delia was leaning against Roscoe's shoulder, which was where she often was in the evenings, having decided some years ago that this was a natural and comfortable place to be. His arm was around her. They had been quiet for a while, the good kind of quiet. "Do you remember," she said, "when I rode into this yard on that borrowed mule?" "I remember," he said. "I had $4.32, she said, "and I thought I will ask for work because work is something I know how to do, and that is all I will ask." "I remember," he said again, softer. "And you gave me work," she said, "and then you gave me everything else." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You gave me everything else. I want to be clear about that." She turned her head to look at him. In the starlight, his face was familiar to her in the bone-deep way that a landscape becomes familiar, not just seen but known, part of the furniture of the interior. She knew the line of his jaw and the dark eyes, and the way his expression changed in those small increments that meant everything when you knew what to look for. "I asked only for work," she said. "I know," he said. "I have been grateful every day since that you did." She kissed him, there on the porch in the starlight, and the owl asked its question and the creek ran on below the ridge, and the dogs shifted at their feet, and the children slept inside, and the ranch settled around them in the night. She had come into this valley with calloused hands and eyes that had seen too much, and she had asked only for work, and what she had found was the thing she had stopped believing she would find, not a rescue, because she did not need rescuing, and not a solution to grief, because grief had its own timetable and resolved itself in its own way, but a partner. A real one. The kind that stands beside you on the ridge and looks at the same view and sees what you see. The kind that makes room for your past without asking you to set it down. The kind that is steady in the particular way that matters most, which is steadiness not of temperament or mood, but of intention, of choice, of who you have decided to be for the other person. Roscoe Underwood had said that he had been waiting for someone like her. She had not quite believed it when he said it. She believed it now. She believed it in the way that she believed in things she could see with her own eyes. The garden that grew from seeds she had planted. The children who were in the house asleep. The man beside her who had been the answer to a question she had not known she was asking when she rode into this yard looking for nothing more than honest work and fair pay. 6 years had passed since that morning, and the hands that held his were still calloused. They would always be calloused, because she had never stopped working and never intended to, and her eyes had seen more than enough, had seen hard things and beautiful things and all the ordinary things that fill up a life until it is full. And here in the falling dark of a Texas evening with the stars coming out, and the sound of the creek and the children sleeping in the house behind her. She understood that this was the whole and completed thing, the real and proper life, the one that she had ridden toward without knowing she was riding toward it, on a borrowed mule with $4.32 and the particular stubborn dignity of a woman who had decided that whatever she was going to be it honestly and without apology. Roscoe pressed his lips to her hair, and she closed her eyes, and the night came fully down on Harlow Creek, and the stars turned overhead as they had always turned, indifferent to the small and enormous happiness of two people on a porch who had found each other in the wide and unlikely country of the world and decided to stay. In the spring of 1887, there was a third child, another boy, named William for no particular reason except that it suited him, dark-eyed like his father and broad-shouldered before he was 2, and already following Thomas around with the single-minded devotion of a younger brother who has found his hero. Ellen supervised both of them with a manner that could only be described as presidential, and Thomas bore his role as hero with patient good humor, and the house that had once held only one man and his quiet was now a fully inhabited, fully alive place, loud in the ways that children make things loud and warm in the ways that people who love each other make things warm. Pete and Carmen Garza were at the celebration when William was born, which was really just a supper that became a celebration in the way that suppers at the W often became celebrations. And Carmen held the baby with the authority of a woman who had held many babies, and Pete clapped Roscoe on the shoulder and said something in Spanish that made Roscoe laugh. And Delia sat at the kitchen table that had been the site of so many significant moments in her life here, and she looked around at the people in the room, her people, the people of this place she had built, and she felt the particular fullness that comes not from having everything but from having the right things. Later, when the guests had gone and the children were asleep and the house was quiet again, she and Roscoe sat in the kitchen with the lamp between them, same as they had always done, same as they would keep doing, and she reached across and put her hand on his, same as she had done the first time years ago, and he turned his hand and held hers, same as he had then. "Are you happy?" he asked her. He did not ask it often. When he asked, it was genuine. She considered it honestly, the way she considered everything. She thought about the borrowed mule and the $4. She thought about Thomas Barrett in the cold earth in Lockhart and the grief of that, which did not go away entirely, which she did not expect to go away entirely, and the acceptance of that, which was itself a kind of peace. She thought about riding into this valley looking for work and finding Roscoe Underwood in his worn blue shirt fixing a fence board. She thought about the ring on her finger that had been his mother's. She thought about Thomas and Ellen and William asleep in the rooms of this house that was hers. She thought about the garden and the kitchen and the long evenings with the lamp and the coffee and the talking and the silences that were better than talking. "Yes," she said. "Completely and specifically yes." He smiled the full smile, the one that had surprised her the first time and had never stopped meaning something to her, and he squeezed her hand, and the lamp burned warm between them, and outside the spring night of Harlow Creek was beginning, with the creek running and the stars out and the Cedar Hills quiet and the wide Texas sky going on in every direction, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, just as it always had been and would be. Long after all the small and enormous loves that played out beneath it had made their marks on the world and passed on, leaving behind them the evidence that they had been real, which was really all that anyone could ask. Delia Barrett Underwood, who had come looking only for work, had found the whole of it, and she had done it with her hands, her eyes, her stubbornness, and the courage to say yes to questions she had not expected anyone to ask. The rest of it, the love, the years, the children, the life, had followed naturally, the way good things follow when you make room for them, which is to say, not easily, not without cost, but surely and completely, and with the full and settled permanence of things that are built right.